To millions of people around the world, the silhouette of Highclere Castle is more than just a building. It is a symbol. Rising from the rolling green hills of Hampshire, its sandstone towers and soaring pinnacles represent a lost world of order, elegance, and aristocratic grace. We know this house. We know the library where the fictional Lord Grantham read his morning correspondence. We know the grand oak staircase where Lady Mary descended in her evening silks. We know the green baize doors that separated the masters upstairs from the servants downstairs. For over a decade, this magnificent estate has entered our living rooms as Downton Abbey, a comforting fantasy where the biggest tragedies are broken engagements and lost inheritances, and where every problem is eventually solved with a cup of tea and a stiff upper lip. But the camera lies, or rather, it tells only the story it wants you to see. When the film crews pack up their lights and the actors remove their costumes, the real Highclere Castle remains, silent and imposing against the grey English sky. And the story etched into its actual walls is not one of polite drama and happy endings. It is a story of desperate gambles, of blood money, and of a terrifying obsession that led the Lord of the Manor far away from the safety of England and into the shadowed valleys of the dead. The true history of this house is not written in the polite ink of a screenwriter's script, but in the dust of ancient tombs and the silence of sudden death. To understand the real Highclere, one must look past the golden glow of the television screen. This is not merely a stage set. It is a witness. It is a structure that has stood for centuries, watching the rise and fall of a single family, the Carnarvons. While the fictional Crawleys worried about changing fashions and local gossip, the real family that inhabited these rooms was fighting a much darker battle for survival. They were not just fighting to keep the roof from leaking or the estate from bankruptcy, though those battles were real enough. They were fighting against a destiny that seemed determined to destroy them. The focal point of this tragedy was George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. He was the real-life master of the house during the era when Downton Abbey is set. But unlike his fictional counterpart, the Earl was not a steady, traditional man content to manage his tenants. He was a man haunted by pain, driven by a reckless need for speed and danger, and ultimately consumed by a fascination with the afterlife. He did not find his purpose in the green fields of Hampshire, but in the scorching sands of Egypt. It was this obsession that would bring Highclere Castle world fame, but at a terrible price. We often look at the great houses of England and see them as monuments to stability, immovable and eternal. But Highclere is different. In the shy 1920s, this house became the centre of a global storm that mixed science, superstition, and tragedy in equal measure. It was here, in the quiet drawing rooms, that the plans were laid to disturb the sleep of a pharaoh. And it was here, in the deep silence of the library, that the consequences of that disturbance would eventually be felt. The story we are about to tell is not a cozy Sunday night drama. It is a Gothic tragedy. It is the story of how an English earl woke a curse that had slept for 3,000 years, and how the golden treasures of Tutankhamun ended up hiding in the dark basements of a British country house. The fiction of Downton Abbey suggests that the past is a safe place to visit, but the reality of Highclere Castle teaches us a very different lesson. The past is dangerous, and sometimes, when you go looking for buried secrets, you find exactly what you were warned against. The golden sandstone of the castle looks warm in the sunlight, but as the 5th Earl would discover, the shadows it casts are very long and very cold. To look at Highclere Castle today is to look at a dream woven in stone. With its confident turrets piercing the sky and its golden facade glowing in the English sunset, It projects an image of eternal, unshakable power. It looks as though it has stood there since the Middle Ages, a fortress of the feudal lords. But this ancient appearance is a magnificent lie. Highclere is not a medieval fortress. It is a Victorian stage set, a costume of greatness draped over a much humbler reality. And like all great costumes, it was designed to hide the truth of what lay beneath. Before the mid-19th century, Highclere was nothing like the palace we see today. It was a sturdy, unremarkable Georgian mansion, a square brick box that was practical, comfortable, and entirely forgettable. But the third Earl of Carnarvon was a man of immense vanity and ambition. He looked at his boring brick home and felt it was unworthy of his lineage. In 1838, he made a decision that would seal the fate of his descendants for generations. He hired Sir Charles Barry, the legendary architect, who was busy designing the Houses of Parliament in London. The Earl's instruction was simple. He wanted a house that would rival the royalty of Europe. He wanted a palace that screamed history. Barry went to work, encasing the old brick structure in a layer of expensive bathstone. He added soaring pinnacles, Italianate towers, and Gothic flourishes. He turned a home into a monument. But monuments are ruinously expensive to build and even more expensive to maintain. By the time the renovations were finished, Highclere was a masterpiece. But it was also a vampire. It required an army of servants to run, tons of coal to heat, and a fortune to repair. It was a beast that needed to be constantly fed with gold. Fast forward to the late 1890s, the architectural dream had turned into a financial nightmare. The agricultural depression had struck Britain hard. Land, which had been the source of aristocratic wealth for centuries, was no longer generating cash. The rents from tenant farmers dried up. The great estates of England were hemorrhaging money, and Highclere was no exception. Enter George Herbert, the fifth Earl of Carnarvon. He was young, dashing, and adventurous, the man who would eventually discover Tutankhamun. But in 1890 he was merely a man standing in a leaking library, staring at ledgers that bled red ink. George was land-rich and cash-poor. He owned 36,000 acres, but he could barely afford to pay the staff. The castle was beginning to fray at the edges. The silk wallpapers were peeling. The roofs threatened to cave in. The silent witness of the house watched as the young Earl paced the freezing corridors, knowing that the legacy of his ancestors was crumbling around him. He had two choices: sell the estate and admit defeat, or find a new source of income. In the Gilded Age, for a British aristocrat, new income meant one thing: a wealthy wife. This was the era of the dollar princesses, where cash-strapped British lords traded their titles for the fortunes of American heiresses. But George did not look to America. He looked to the banking dynasties of Europe. In 1895, he found his savior. Her name was Almina Wombwell. Almina was 19 years old, petite, beautiful, and possessed of a fortune that was staggering even by the standards of the time. Officially, she was the daughter of a French officer. But all of London whispered the open secret. Almina was the illegitimate daughter of Alfred de Rothschild, the fabulously wealthy unmarried partner of the banking giant N.M. Rothschild and Sons. Alfred adored Almina. He could not give her his name, but he could give her money, mountains of it. And he could buy her the one thing his money couldn't naturally acquire: a coronet. The marriage between George Herbert and Almina Wombwell was the ultimate transaction of the age. It was a merger. George brought the history, the title, and the crumbling castle. Almina brought the liquidity. Alfred de Rothschild provided a dowry of 150,000, equivalent to over 15 million today, and promised to pay off the Earl's debts. He essentially purchased Highclere Castle for his daughter. When Almina moved in, the paper palace turned into a palace of gold. The transformation was instantaneous and blinding. The Rothschild money flowed through the corridors like a transfusion of lifeblood. Almina ordered the dark, heavy Victorian furniture to be thrown out. She brought in French silk, bright colours and electricity. She hired an army of footmen and chefs. She threw lavish parties where champagne flowed like water, and the guests were dazzled by the sheer scale of the luxury. To the outsider, it looked like a fairy tale, the handsome Earl and his beautiful, rich Countess living in their revitalized castle. But the walls knew the truth. This new golden age was built on a fragile foundation. George was a man of pride, and living entirely on his wife's and her secret father's money chafed at him. He was the master of the house, yet he was financially dependent on the teenage girl sitting at the other end of the dining table. The castle had been saved, yes, the roof was fixed, the lights were on, and the silver was polished. But Highclere had become a gilded cage for the Earl, a place where every new painting and every repaired stone was a reminder that his own heritage wasn't enough to sustain him. It was this restless energy, this need to prove himself as something more than just a husband to a fortune, that would soon drive him away from the damp, green hills of England and toward the burning ambition that waited in the sands of Egypt. And the house was perfect again, but its master was bored, broke in spirit, and looking for an escape. If the walls of Highclere Castle could speak, they would tell you that George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, was a man who lived life as if he were trying to outrun his own shadow. Before he became the frail, walking-stick-wielding figure known to history books, he was Motor Carnarvon, one of the most reckless adrenaline junkies in Edwardian England. He did not care for the slow, stuffy rituals of the aristocracy. He craved speed. He owned some of the first automobiles ever built in Britain and drove them at terrifying velocities across the country roads, terrifying the local peasantry and scandalizing his peers. He was a man possessed by a need for motion, perhaps sensing that stillness was a form of death. But in 1901, on a winding road in Germany, his luck finally ran out. The accident was catastrophic. While cresting a hill at high speed near Bad Schwalbach, the Earl's car swerved to avoid an ox cart and rolled over, crushing him beneath its iron weight. He was pulled from the wreckage, barely alive. His injuries were horrific: a severe concussion, broken legs, shattered ribs, and, most critically, permanent damage to his lungs. The doctors saved his life, but they could not save the man he used to be. Motor Carnarvon died on that German roadside. The man who returned to Highclere was a broken bird, fragile, constantly breathless, and racked by agonizing pain that would never fully leave him. This tragedy fundamentally altered the relationship between the Earl and his castle. Highclere, with its damp stone walls and the wet, freezing mists of the English winter, suddenly transformed from a home into a health hazard. Every breath of cold Hampshire air felt like a razor in George's damaged lungs. His doctors issued a stark ultimatum. If he spent another winter in England, he would die. He needed heat. He needed dry air. He needed the sun. And so began the great annual migration that would define the rest of his life. Like a migratory bird fleeing the frost, Lord Carnarvon began to spend his winters in Egypt. In the early 20th century, Cairo was the playground of the invalid elite, a place where wealthy Europeans went to heal their bodies and flaunt their fortunes. But for a man of George's restless intelligence, sitting on the terrace of the Winter Palace Hotel, sipping tea, was a form of torture. He possessed an active mind trapped in a ruined body. He tried stamp collecting, but it bored him. He tried photography, but it wasn't enough. He needed a hunt. He needed the thrill of discovery to replace the thrill of speed he had lost. He found it in the sand, Egyptology was the fashionable obsession of the age, a gentleman's game where rich men could buy permits to dig up the past. George began tentatively, scratching at the surface of the desert, finding small trinkets and jars. But he quickly realized he was an amateur in a game that required surgical precision. He had the money, thanks to Almina, and he had the passion, but he lacked the skill. He needed a guide. He needed a partner who could see through the sand and read the language of the dead. In 1907, fate arranged a meeting that would change history. At the suggestion of a mutual friend, Lord Carnarvon was introduced to Howard Carter. Carter was everything the Earl was not. While George was a polished, charming aristocrat, Carter was a difficult, prickly, solitary man from a modest background. He was an artist turned archaeologist, a man known for his terrible temper and his brilliant instinct. He had been fired from the Egyptian Antiquities Service for fighting with French tourists. He was unemployed, destitute, and living in a mud-brick house, selling paintings to survive. They were the oddest of couples, the wealthy invalid Earl and the stubborn, abrasive genius. But they bonded over a shared obsession. Carnarvon saw in Carter the tool he needed to unlock the secrets of the desert. Carter saw in Carnarvon the one thing he had spent his life searching for, a patron with deep pockets and the patience to support a long game. They shook hands, sealing a pact that would lead them to glory and ruin. Back in England, Highclere Castle stood empty and silent for months at a time. The servants covered the furniture in dust sheets. The great fires in the hearths were allowed to die out. The silent witness waited in the gloom while its master poured the family fortune into the Egyptian sands. The dynamic of the estate shifted. The wealth that Almina had brought to save the castle was now being siphoned off to pay for workers, supplies, and permits in the Valley of the Kings. For years they found little. They dug in the heat, battling swarms of flies, bureaucratic red tape, and the crushing disappointment of empty pits. The First World War interrupted their work, turning the world upside down, but as soon as the guns fell silent, they returned. By 1922, the situation had become dire. The Rothschild money was not infinite. The cost of maintaining Highclere and funding the excavations was bleeding the family dry. George, now looking far older than his 56 years, was weary. He summoned Carter to Highclere and delivered the news the archaeologist feared most. The funding was cutting off. There would be no more digging. But Carter, desperate and convinced he was close to something monumental, pleaded with the Earl. He offered to pay for one final season of digging with his own money he didn't have. Moved by his friend's desperation, and perhaps tempted by one last roll of the dice, Lord Carnarvon agreed. He would fund one final season, one last winter in the sun. They didn't know it yet, but they were signing their own death warrants. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and deep in the Valley of the Kings, beneath tons of limestone rubble, a boy king was waiting for them, ready to unleash a story that would echo from the desert canyons all the way back to the green hills of Highclere. November 1922. The Valley of the Kings lay baking under the indifferent Egyptian sun, a desolate landscape of limestone and dust that had been churned over by treasure hunters for centuries. To the naked eye, it was empty. Every expert agreed that the valley had been picked clean. There was nothing left to find. Howard Carter's team, funded by the last scraps of Lord Carnarvon's patience and money, was working near the entrance of the tomb of Rameses VI. It was an area they had ignored for years, covered in the debris of ancient workmen's huts. It was their final attempt. If this ground yielded nothing, the partnership would end. The digging would stop, and the Earl would return to Highclere Castle to live out his remaining days in defeat. But history often turns on the smallest of moments. On the morning of November 4th, a waterboy, fetching jars for the thirsty workmen, stumbled on a stone in the sand. He brushed it away. It wasn't a rock, it was a step. Specifically a step cut into the bedrock, leading down into the darkness. Carter was summoned immediately. His men began to dig with a feverish intensity, and slowly a staircase emerged. 12 steps down, they found a blocked doorway plastered with seals. Carter leaned in, his heart hammering against his ribs. The seals were intact. They bore the jackal god Anubis, guardian of the dead, but more importantly, below them was a name that had been erased from history for 3,000 years, Tutankhamun. Carter froze. He could have broken the door down right there, but he was a man of honor, and he knew who had paid for this moment. He ordered the staircase to be refilled with sand to hide it from thieves and marched to the telegraph office in Luxor. He sent a cable to Highclere Castle that would become legendary. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations! When the telegram arrived at Highclere, the castle erupted. The gloom that had hung over the estate vanished instantly. Lord Carnarvon, forgetting his frailty and his pain, packed his trunks with the energy of a man half his age. He grabbed his daughter, Lady Evelyn, and raced across Europe and the Mediterranean to stand beside his friend. He had spent a fortune searching for a needle in a haystack, and now the needle was in his hand. On November 26th, the two men, accompanied by Lady Evelyn, stood at the bottom of the cleared staircase. They faced a second sealed door. The air was thick with the dust of centuries and the heavy weight of anticipation. Carter picked up an iron rod and made a tiny breach in the upper left-hand corner of the doorway. He inserted a candle to test for foul gases. The flame flickered in the hot air escaping from the chamber, air that had not moved since the Bronze Age. Carnarvon stood behind him, trembling with impatience. "Can you see anything?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the narrow passage. Carter stood paralyzed. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, the light of the candle caught a reflection, then another, then 1,000 gold everywhere. Golden chariots, golden couches, golden statues of sentinel kings. It was a chaotic, impossible treasure trove piled to the ceiling. Carter turned slowly, his face pale with shock, and whispered the words that would define his legacy. Yes, wonderful things. They had done the impossible. They had found the only unlooted royal tomb in the history of Egyptology. In that moment, standing in the flickering candlelight, Lord Carnarvon was the happiest man on earth. He had justified every penny spent, every doubt ignored. He was immortal. But as the news broke and the world's press descended on Luxor, a shadow fell over the triumph. The locals whispered that the tomb should not have been disturbed. They spoke of the Pharaoh's curse, a warning that death would come on swift wings to those who touched the king's rest. Carter, a man of science, laughed it off. But then an incident occurred that silenced the laughter. On the very day the tomb was opened, Carter returned to his house to find a scene of horror. He had kept a pet canary in a cage, a cheerful yellow bird that the workers called the golden bird and considered a good luck charm. When Carter entered his room, he found a royal cobra, the symbol of the pharaoh's power, the very snake worn on the crown of Tutankhamun, inside the cage. The snake had eaten the canary. The Egyptian workers were terrified. "But the pharaoh has spoken," they whispered. "The snake has eaten the bird of luck. This is the beginning of the end." Lord Carnarvon, basking in the flashbulbs of the paparazzi, ignored the omen. He was busy planning the extraction of the treasures that would fill the museums of the world. He didn't know that the snake in the cage was just the first warning. The seal had been broken, the air of the tomb had been breathed. And the swift wings of death were already gathering on the horizon, preparing to fly not just to the hotel in Cairo, but all the way across the sea to the quiet, unsuspecting halls of Highclere Castle. In the end, it was not a mummy walking wrapped in bandages that came for Lord Carnarvon. It was not a phantom emerging from the shadows of the tomb to strangle him. The agent of the so-called curse was far more subtle and far more efficient. It was a microscopic assassin. In late February 1923, just months after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon was in high spirits. He had achieved the impossible. The world lay at his feet. But while sitting on the deck of a boat on the Nile, basking in the glory of his discovery, a mosquito landed on his cheek. It bit him, a trivial annoyance in a country filled with them. A few days later, while shaving in his room at the Hotel Continental in Cairo, the Earl's razor slipped. He accidentally sliced open the top of the mosquito bite. It was a small nick, as the kind that usually heals with a dab of iodine, but the wound did not heal. It became infected. The infection turned into erysipelas and then quickly escalated into blood poisoning. The frail health that had plagued George since his car accident decades earlier now betrayed him completely. His lungs, already damaged, succumbed to pneumonia. The man who had commanded excavations of colossal statues was now being destroyed by something invisible to the naked eye. By early April, the king of excavators lay dying in his hotel's suite. The heat of Cairo was oppressive, but the heat inside Carnarvon's body was worse. He slipped into a feverish delirium. His family gathered around his bedside, his wife Almina, who had bankrupted herself to fund his dream, and his daughter, Evelyn. They watched helplessly as the man who had saved Highclere Castle burned up from the inside. In his delirium, George reportedly shouted out, "Fighting unseen enemies." Some witnesses claimed he cried, "I have heard the call, I am preparing," as if responding to a summons from the ancient world he had disturbed. Then came the night of April 5th, 1923. The events of this night have been debated by historians and skeptics for a century, but they remain part of the legend that refuses to die. At approximately 1:55 a.m., Lord Carnarvon stopped breathing. The fifth Earl was dead. At that precise moment, something inexplicable happened. According to multiple reports, all the lights in the Hotel Continental flickered and died. But it wasn't just the hotel. The entire city of Cairo was plunged into sudden, total darkness. The municipal power grid had failed without explanation. There were no storms, no technical breakdowns found later. For a few terrifying minutes, the city of the living was as dark as the city of the dead. The engineers at the power station were baffled. When they checked the equipment later, everything was in working order. The darkness had come, claimed the soul of the Earl, and lifted. But the strangest event did not happen in Egypt. It happened thousands of miles away, in the quiet, rain-soaked countryside of England. At Highclere Castle it was 4 a.m. The house was asleep. The servants were in their quarters. The corridors were silent. In the library, Lord Carnarvon's favourite dog, a terrier named Susie, was sleeping in her basket. Susie was devoted to the Earl. She had been his constant companion before his trips to Egypt took him away. Suddenly the silence of the castle was shattered. A footman on the night shift reported hearing a piercing, unearthly howl echoing from the library. He ran to the room, fearing an intruder. What he found was Susie, standing rigid, trembling violently. She let out one final agonizing yelp, collapsed onto the rug, and died instantly. There was no medical reason for the dog's death. She had been healthy. Later, when the telegram arrived from Cairo announcing the Earl's passing, the family compared the times. Accounting for the time difference between Egypt and England, Susie had died at the exact moment her master's heart stopped beating, in the Hotel Continental. The news of the coincidences struck the world like a thunderclap. The press went into a frenzy.
"The curse of the Pharaohs!" screamed the headlines. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and a believer in the spiritual, publicly stated that an evil elemental spirit guarding the tomb likely caused the Earl's death. The public was terrified. People began mailing Egyptian artifacts they owned to the British Museum, begging to get rid of them, fearing they too would be cursed. For Almina, the grieving widow, the terror was personal. She had lost her husband to the obsession she had funded. Now she had to transport his body back to England. But even the journey home was marred by fear. It was said that as the ship, carrying Carnarvon's coffin, left the port of Alexandria, a great bird, some say a hawk, the symbol of Horus, circled the vessel 3 times before flying back toward the desert, as if escorting its prisoner to the edge of its domain. The body returned to Highclere. George Herbert was buried on the highest hill of the estate, Beacon Hill, overlooking the home he had loved and the lands he had tried to save. But he did not return alone. The shadow of the curse had followed him back to Hampshire. The silent witness of Highclere Castle now held a new, dark energy. The glorious discovery had turned into a ghost story, and the family was left to wonder, was the gold worth the blood? And what else was hiding in the crates that were still being shipped from the Nile to the basement of their ancestral home? After the funeral on Beacon Hill, a terrified silence descended upon Highclere Castle. The excitement of the discovery had evaporated, replaced by a heavy, suffocating dread. Lady Almina, now a widow, was left to deal with the aftermath. The curse of the Pharaohs was the talk of the world, but for Almina the problem was far more practical: death duties. The British government demanded a fortune in taxes upon the Earl's death. The Rothschild millions were dwindling. To save the castle once again, she had to make a cold calculation. She had to sell the treasure. Most of the spectacular finds from the Earl's private collection, items that had not been found in Tutankhamun's tomb but in previous digs, were packed up and sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Almina wanted them gone. She wanted the cursed objects out of her house. But not everything left. Whether by accident, oversight, or a lingering sentimental attachment to her husband's passion, a significant number of Egyptian artifacts remained behind. For more than 60 years, these objects lay hidden in the depths of Highclere Castle. They were tucked away in secret cupboards between the drawing rooms, concealed behind false panels, and buried in the dust of the basements. The silent witness guarded them. While the world outside forgot about Lord Carnarvon's connection to the castle itself held on to the relics of the dead. Servants whispered about cold spots in the corridors. Guests reported strange feelings of being watched. The legend of the curse faded into a local rumor, but the physical proof of the obsession was still there. Sleeping in the dark, waiting to be found. It wasn't until 1987 that the current Earl's grandfather discovered the hidden stash. Opening a cupboard that hadn't been touched in decades, he found jars, jewelry, and statues staring back at him. The Carnarvons realized that they had been living on top of a private museum all along.
Today, these items are on display in the cellars of the castle, an Egyptian exhibition that sits eerily beneath the English Gothic library, a permanent reminder of the link between the Hampshire mud and the desert sand. But even with the treasures revealed, the curse of the maintenance returned to haunt Highclere. By the early 2000s, history was repeating itself. The castle was once again in a state of dire disrepair. The stone was eroding, the plumbing was ancient, and the cost of running the estate was astronomical. The 8th Earl and Countess faced the same terrifying choice that George Herbert had faced a century earlier: find a miracle or lose the house. And then the miracle arrived, but this time it didn't come from a wealthy heiress or a pharaoh's tomb. It came from a television producer. When Julian Fellowes wrote Downton Abbey, he wrote it specifically with Highclere Castle in mind. He was a friend of the family and knew the house's layout intimately. When the show premiered in 2010, it became a global phenomenon. Suddenly, the Paper Palace was flooded with a new kind of gold: tourism. Millions of fans flocked to see the home of the Crawleys. They paid to walk the stairs, to see the library, to have tea in the gardens. The revenue from the show and the visitors allowed the Carnarvons to repair the roof, fix the turrets, and secure the future of the estate for another generation. There is a profound irony in this salvation. The real 5th Earl, George Herbert, died trying to find a treasure that would immortalize his name and save his house. He succeeded, but it cost him his life. Today, his house is saved not by his dangerous reality, but by a comforting fiction. Visitors come looking for the ghost of Lady Sybil or Matthew Crawley, unaware that the real ghost, the ghost of the man who woke the curse, is watching them from his grave on the hill. Highclere Castle stands today as a monument to the complexity of legacy. It is a house built on ambition, saved by marriage, cursed by excavation, and rescued by television. It is a survivor. As the sun sets over the parkland, casting long shadows over the cedar trees, the castle remains the ultimate silent witness. It keeps its secrets in the cellar and wears its fictional mask for the cameras. But if you listen closely to the wind rattling the windows of the high towers, you might hear a whisper from the past. It is a warning from the Earl who ventured too far. Beware what you dig for, you might just find it.